Louis Brennan woke up exactly 1 minute before his alarm was set to go off. It was always like that. 15 years as a middle manager at Midwestern Protect Insurance Company had given him an internal clock more accurate than a Swiss watch. His eyes opened at 6:29. His hand reached for the phone and deactivated the alarm before it had a chance to make a sound. Haley was sleeping peacefully next to him. Her blonde hair was scattered across the pillow, and Louis noticed that her roots were starting to grow out. She would have to go to the salon again soon. Louis carefully got out of bed, trying not to wake his wife. He tiptoed to the bathroom and closed the door. He met his own reflection in the mirror. 42 years old, but looking like he was 55. Receding hairline, bags under his eyes, and a small belly that he couldn't seem to get rid of, despite regular but joyless trips to the gym on Saturdays. A classic representative of the middle class in the classic American town of Rockford, Illinois. The breakfast he made for himself was as predictable as his whole life: oatmeal, peanut butter on toast, orange juice. Louis chewed, scrolling through the news feed on his phone, though he wasn't really reading anything. Lately, he had found himself increasingly going through the motions of his daily routine without putting any meaning into it. 17 years of marriage, a mortgage that was 2/3 paid off, one vacation a year, usually to Florida, no children. At first they wanted to live for themselves, then they pursued their careers, and then it turned out that Haley had fertility issues. Now they didn't even want to. Louis kissed his sleepy wife on the cheek before leaving. She mumbled something unintelligible and pulled the blanket up higher. On Wednesdays, she didn't start her shift at the library until lunchtime. Haley had a master's degree in literature, but she never pursued a full-time teaching career. Louis sometimes thought he was partly to blame for that. Midwest Protect's office was located in a glass 12-story tower, the tallest building in Rockford's business district. Louis's department occupied a quarter of the 8th floor. 8 desks, 8 computers, 8 equally dreary employees. Louis nodded to his colleagues, hung his jacket on the back of his chair, and turned on his computer. Wednesday mornings were usually devoted to weekly reports, numbers, graphs, comments for management. Louis sorted through the accident insurance sales data for the previous week and thought about how he himself was completely uninsured against the ultimate accident, the meaninglessness of his own life. At 12:30, he left for lunch. Louis usually grabbed a sandwich at the cafe across the street and ate at his desk, but today, on a whim, he decided to walk to Bella Napoli, an Italian restaurant 3 blocks from the office. It was an impulsive decision, perhaps the most spontaneous thing he had done in the last month. Bella Napoli was a cozy place with red checkered tablecloths and photographs of Italy on the walls. Louis was about to enter when he noticed a familiar silhouette through the large window. Haley. His wife was sitting at a corner table with her back to the entrance. Opposite her was a man Louis had never seen before, dark-haired with fashionable stubble and an expensive-looking jacket. Louis froze. Something about his wife's posture, the way she leaned toward her companion, the way she laughed, covering her mouth with her hand, made his stomach clench painfully. This was a different Haley, not the tired woman who had sat silently next to him on the couch for the past few years, buried in a book or her phone. He took a step back so they wouldn't notice him through the window. His heart was pounding in his throat. His first impulse was to burst in, make a scene, demand an explanation. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the fear of hearing the answers to questions he was afraid to ask even himself. Or maybe it was some kind of morbid curiosity. Louis walked over to a newsstand across from the restaurant and pretended to look at magazines. 20 minutes later, Haley and the stranger came out of the restaurant. Now Louis could get a better look at him. Tall, fit, about 40 years old. They stood close together, too close for casual acquaintances. The man said something, and Haley laughed again, the same laugh Louis hadn't heard in years. Then they started walking, and Louis, without knowing why, followed at a safe distance. The couple moved slowly down the street, stopping occasionally to look at shop windows. At one point, the man put his arm around Haley's shoulder, and she didn't pull away. They turned onto a residential street lined with neat two-story houses. The stranger opened the gate of one of them, a brick house with a well-kept lawn. Lewis stopped around the corner, watching his wife and this man walk up the steps. And then Haley did something that broke something inside Lewis. She took off her wedding ring, a simple gold band he had put on her finger 17 years ago. Then she reached up to her ears and took off her aquamarine earrings, his gift to her on their 10th anniversary. She carefully tucked the jewelry into her purse, and only then did she follow the man into the house. Lewis stood motionless for another 5 minutes, maybe longer. He felt neither anger nor despair, only a strange numbness, as if he were watching a movie about someone else's life. Then he slowly took out his phone, opened the search engine, and entered the address of the house. A few minutes later, he knew that the building belonged to a man named Elliot Forsyth. A couple more searches on social media, and he had the whole story. Elliot Forsyth, professor of art history at a local college. Judging by the old photos Lewis found on his wife's profile, he and Haley had gone to school together. They had dated. They broke up shortly before she met Lewis. He glanced at his watch. 2:45. Lunch break was long over, but Lewis had no intention of returning to the office. Instead, he slowly walked to his car, parked not far from work. He got behind the wheel but didn't start the engine. One thought ran through his head. Was there ever a single real day in our marriage? At 4:10, he was still sitting in his car when he saw Haley come out of the Forsyth house. They said goodbye at the gate for a long time. They kissed. Then his wife opened her purse, took out her ring and earrings and put them on. She turned back into Mrs. Brannigan, who would now probably go to her shift at the library as if nothing had happened. That was the moment when something in Lewis finally broke. Not his love for his wife, that had died long ago, leaving behind only habit and the comfort of living together. The very structure of his life had broken down, the illusion of stability that he had so diligently maintained all these years. Lewis started his car and drove not home or to the office, but straight to the bank. He withdrew almost all the money from their joint account, leaving just enough to pay the mortgage for the next month. Then he drove home, quickly gathered the essentials, clothes, documents, his laptop. He wrote a short email to his boss, resigning for personal reasons. He left no note for Haley. He simply disappeared from her life as suddenly as she had disappeared from his, a long time ago, but he hadn't noticed, didn't want to notice. Lewis drove west on the highway with no clear plan. At some point, he turned on the radio. An old Bruce Springsteen song, "Darkness on the Town," was playing. He had never been particularly fond of Springsteen, but now the lyrics about escaping a small town and searching for oneself on the endless roads of America resonated with painful clarity. At a gas station a couple of hours' drive from Rockford, he saw a sign, "Truck drivers wanted. No experience necessary, training provided." Lewis wrote down the phone number. In college, he had a part-time job delivering goods for a local supermarket. He had always loved the open road, but then life had sucked him into a 9-to-5 office job, a mortgage, and a retirement plan. The next day, Lewis was at an interview at Horizon Logistics, a transportation company in Davenport, Iowa. A week later, he was taking advanced training courses to get his truck driver's license. A month later, he was behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, transporting electronics from Chicago to Denver. The road had a strange calming effect on him, the monotonous hum of the engine, the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching to the horizon, the roadside cafes where no one knew his name and no one cared about him. Sleeping in the cab of his truck under the starry sky in the middle of Nebraska, sunrises over the deserts of Nevada, Lewis felt like he was learning to breathe again. Sometimes at night, lying on the narrow bunk in his truck cab, he thought about Haley. Had she found his letter in the pocket of his old jacket, the one where the lawyer explained the divorce proceedings and the division of property? Was she now living with Elliot Forsyth? Did she regret what had happened, even a little? But these thoughts came to him less and less often, dissolving into the endless flash of white lines under the wheels of the truck. Louis Brennan was gone. Now he was just Louis, a truck driver for Horizon Logistics, a man with no past and an uncertain future. And for the first time in many years, he felt truly alive. 3 months on the road had changed Louis into a different person. His skin had become rough and tanned where the sun shone through the side window. He had grown a beard, at first out of laziness, then out of practicality. His hands grew harder from constantly gripping the steering wheel. His speech changed, picking up the special jargon of truckers, short, concise phrases that only people in his new profession could understand. The cab of the truck, which he now called home, smelled of coffee from a thermos, cheap cologne, and something elusively personal. On the dashboard was a figurine of an eagle with outstretched wings, a gift from a fellow truck driver in Texas. Louis didn't know why he had kept this trinket, but he liked the way the morning sun reflected off the metal feathers. He easily mastered his new job. Long hours of driving, loading, and unloading, spending the night in truck stops or right in the cab in the middle of nowhere. Paperwork, trip tickets, waybills, driving logs. Louis did everything neatly and accurately, as he had become accustomed to during his years working for an insurance company. His bosses at Horizon Logistics liked that. However, inside, he still felt empty. Having cut all ties with his past, Louis had never created anything new. He had no friends, only casual conversations with other drivers in parking lots or with waitresses in roadside cafes. He didn't share his story with anyone and wasn't interested in other people's lives. Sometimes he called his mother just to say he was alive and well without going into details about his sudden divorce and career change. The freedom he found turned out to be twofold. On the one hand, he could go anywhere, take orders to different parts of the country, and not have to explain anything to anyone. On the other hand, this freedom was filled with loneliness. Louis often listened to audiobooks to fill the silence in the cab. Detective stories, science fiction, occasionally classics. The voices of the actors reading the text created the illusion of company. Sometimes he sang along with the radio, although he had never particularly liked music. Or he talked to himself, an old habit he had broken during his marriage to Haley, but which had returned in the solitude of the road. On Wednesday, August 8th, his route took him to Sever, South Dakota, a tiny town lost among endless fields of corn and soybeans. Louis delivered agricultural equipment to a local farmers' cooperative and stopped for lunch at Mabel's, a typical American diner with a neon sign and chrome accents. Inside, it smelled of fried bacon and coffee. Louis settled down at the counter and ordered the daily special, a meatloaf with mashed potatoes. He chewed slowly, scrolling through the news on his phone when he felt someone's eyes on him. Sitting at a corner table was a woman of about 35 with short brown hair and attentive gray eyes. She was looking directly at him with a strange expression, not flirtatious, not appraising, but rather studying. Louis caught her gaze, and the woman did not look away as people usually do in such situations. Instead, she smiled slightly and nodded. Louis looked away awkwardly. He had long since grown unaccustomed to female attention. Although the divorce had been quick thanks to a good lawyer and Haley's unwillingness to drag it out, Louis wasn't looking for a new relationship. He had enough problems as it was. He paid and was already heading for the exit when the woman called after him. "Hey, trucker, can you give me a ride to Rapid City?" Louis stopped and turned around. She was standing at her table, short, thin, but with a kind of inner strength in her posture. She was wearing worn jeans, a plaid shirt, and a well-worn leather jacket. A small backpack stood next to her. "I don't take passengers," Lewis replied. "That's too bad. The bus isn't until tomorrow and I need to get there today. I'll pay for the gas," the woman said with a slight accent that Lewis couldn't place. Something southern but not Texas or Louisiana. "It's against company policy." "I understand. Have a good day then." She didn't insist and returned to her table. Lewis got out, got into his truck, and started the engine. He glanced at his watch. It was about 200 miles to Rapid City, a 3-hour drive. He only had an empty semi-trailer. He was supposed to pick up a load at a warehouse in Rapid City and take it to Cheyenne. No one would know about his passenger. Without knowing why, he turned off the engine, got out of the cab, and returned to the diner. The woman was still sitting at the table, stirring her long, cold coffee with a spoon. "I'm going to Rapid City. I can give you a ride," Lewis said. She smiled, not happily, but with a strange sense of relief. "Thanks. That'll be $30 for the gas and the interesting conversation." "I can't guarantee the conversation. I'm not very talkative," Lewis warned her honestly. "That's no problem. My name is Velma. Velma Reed." "Lewis." "Just Lewis?" she asked, picking up her backpack. "Just Lewis," he nodded. "Let's go, Mrs. Reed." "Miss," she corrected, "but Velma is fine." They drove in silence for the first half hour. Lewis concentrated on the road, while Velma looked out the window at the cornfields flying by. Then she broke the silence. "How long have you been on the road, Lewis?" "About 3 months," he replied. "You're new. What did you do before?" Lewis hesitated. "I worked in an office, an insurance company." "What happened?" "Nothing special. I just realized it was time for a change." Velma nodded understandingly. "I know what you mean. Sometimes you wake up and realize you can't go through another day like the one before." Lewis glanced at her quickly. There was something in those words that resonated with him. "Exactly," he agreed laconically. "Where are you going?" Lewis asked after a pause. "Rapid City," she replied with a slight smile. "I mean, what are you going to do there? Work? Family?" "Neither. Just no one knows me there." It could have been a joke, but Velma's tone was serious. Lewis felt a strange connection with this stranger again. After all, he was doing the same thing, going somewhere where no one knew him. A light rain began to fall outside. The drops drummed on the roof of the cab, creating a cozy background noise. Velma took a small flask out of her jacket pocket and offered it to Lewis. "Whiskey?" "I'm driving." He shook his head. "Smart." She nodded and took a sip. "My father liked responsible people like you. He was a sheriff in a small town in Alabama." "Did you follow in his footsteps?" "No," Velma smiled. "I'm more the kind of person sheriffs catch." Lewis didn't know if she was joking or not, but decided not to pursue the subject. Instead, he turned on the radio. An old Tom Petty hit, "Running Away," came on. "Leaving doesn't mean running away," Velma said suddenly, staring at the road ahead. "What?" "I mean, sometimes we get in the car and think we're getting away from our problems, but the problems are right there in the car with us." Lewis was silent. This strange woman seemed to be reading his mind, saying aloud what he didn't dare to think. "I'm sorry," she added after a pause. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's okay," Lewis replied. "You're right." They fell silent again, but this time it wasn't awkward. There was something shared between them, a kind of understanding without words. By the time they reached the outskirts of Rapid City, the rain had intensified, turning into a downpour. Visibility dropped to a minimum. Lewis slowed down, straining to see the road through the steadily working windshield wipers. "Where should I drop you off?" he asked. Velma shrugged. "Somewhere downtown. I'll find a motel." "In this rain?" Lewis was surprised at his own suggestion, but said it anyway. "I've got 2 days parking in Rapid City. You can spend the night in a trucker's motel, it's cheap, and tomorrow you can decide what to do next." Velma looked at him intently. "You do realize I could be anyone, right? I could have a knife in my backpack, or a gun." "I've got a crowbar under my seat," Lewis replied calmly. "And for some reason, I don't think you're the type to kill random drivers for $200 in their wallet." Velma laughed, a strange, hoarse laugh. "You're right. I'm very selective about my victims." At the Silver Creek truck stop, they got neighboring rooms at a motel, simple rooms with a bed, a TV, and a tiny bathroom. They had dinner at the motel diner, barely speaking. When they said goodbye in the hallway, Velma suddenly said, "I'm going to Cheyenne tomorrow. If you're going that way—" "That's where I'm headed," Lewis nodded. "Shall we leave at 8? 8, she agreed and disappeared into her room. Thus began their strange friendship. Lewis didn't notice how Velma became his constant traveling companion. She never imposed herself on him and always paid her share of the gas. Sometimes she would disappear for a few days or even weeks, then suddenly show up at a truck stop with a backpack on her shoulders and ask for a ride to the next town. Lewis never asked where she had been or what she had been doing. She wasn't interested in the details of his work. It was an unspoken agreement between them not to pry into each other's past. But gradually, through snippets of conversation, Lewis began to piece together a portrait of this mysterious woman. Velma was from a small town in Alabama. Her father had indeed been a sheriff and had died of a heart attack when she was 15. Her mother had drunk herself to death. Velma had left home early and traveled extensively by hitchhiking. Velma was vague and contradictory about where she had worked and what she had done. Sometimes she said she had been a nurse, sometimes a bartender, sometimes doing seasonal work. Lewis suspected that most of these stories were made up, but it didn't bother him. One evening, when they were staying at a motel in Montana, Velma knocked on his door. She was wearing a fresh shirt and her hair was damp from the shower. She brought a bottle of whiskey in 2 plastic cups. "It's kind of my birthday today," she said. "Will you keep me company?" "What do you mean, kind of?" Lewis asked, letting her into the room. "Well, not exactly my birthday. More like an anniversary, the day I started my new life." They sat down on the edge of the bed, the only place in the room besides the rickety chair at the desk. Velma poured whiskey into the cups. "To freedom," she said, raising her cup. "To freedom," Lewis echoed. The whiskey burned his throat. Velma leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes. "You know, Lewis, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad I met you." "Me too," he replied honestly. "You're the only person in a long time I can just be with. No pretending, no acting." Lewis nodded. He knew what she meant. With Velma, he didn't have to keep up the appearance of a normal life, like he did with his mother on the phone. He didn't have to pretend to be a simple truck driver like he did with his co-workers. They were both running from their past, and that created a strange bond between them. Velma poured more whiskey. They drank in silence, listening to the rain outside. Then she suddenly asked, "Have you ever wanted to kill someone, Lewis?" He choked on his whiskey. "What?" "I'm serious. Have you ever looked at a person and thought, the world would be better off without you?" Lewis thought about it. He remembered looking at Elliot Forsyth, the man his wife had left him for. He remembered the cold rage that rose inside him. "Maybe," he replied honestly. "But there's a big difference between thinking and doing." "What if there were no consequences?" Velma persisted. "If you knew for sure you wouldn't get caught?" "Still no. I couldn't live with it." Verma looked at him intently as if evaluating his answer. Then she nodded, as if he had passed some kind of test. "You're a good man, Lewis. Maybe too good for this world." There was something disturbing, almost sad, in her voice. Lewis felt an inexplicable desire to protect this strange woman from what he didn't know. Over time, Lewis began to notice disturbing moments in Velma's behavior. Sometimes she would disappear in the middle of the night and return only in the early morning, tired but strangely animated. She often changed her appearance, sometimes growing her hair long, sometimes dyeing it a different color, sometimes wearing glasses without lenses. Once he noticed a wad of cash tied with a rubber band in her backpack. She explained that she didn't trust banks, but Lewis wasn't sure that was the whole truth. But the most disturbing thing was her disappearances, which strangely coincided with news of crimes in places they had recently passed through. Once in Boise, a jewelry store was robbed the day after Velma said she needed to stay there for a couple of days. Another time, in Portland, a man's body was found in a motel where they had stayed a week earlier. Lewis told himself it was coincidence, but sometimes, looking at Velma sleeping in the chair next to him, he wondered who he had let into his life. Still, he couldn't deny that he had grown attached to her. She was the only constant in his new life, the only one who knew him. Not the Lewis Brennan from Rockford, but the Lewis of today, a truck driver with no past and no future. She understood his silence, his reluctance to talk about what was left behind. Perhaps because she was the same. In October, when the first frost had already silvered the roadsides in the northern states, they were driving from Minneapolis to Chicago. Velma was unusually quiet. "What are you thinking about?" Lewis asked. "That good things don't last forever," she replied, looking out the window. "Sooner or later, everything ends." "What are you talking about?" "About us, Lewis. About our friendship. I'm leaving soon. Far away." He felt a strange twinge in his chest. Over the past few months, he had grown so accustomed to Velma's presence, to their silent partnership on the road, that the thought of her leaving was almost physically painful. "Where?" was all he could ask. "Somewhere where no one will find me," she replied mysteriously. "No one will find you." Velma turned to him, and for a moment her face became hard, almost predatory. "People who want to stop me." "Velma, what are you involved in?" "It's better if you don't know," she said, placing her hand on his shoulder. "Really, Lewis? The less you know, the safer you'll be." He wanted to ask her more, but something in her gaze stopped him. Maybe she was right. Maybe some secrets were better left untold. That night, in a cheap motel on the outskirts of Chicago, they just sat there watching some old movie on TV. Velma rested her head on his shoulder. There was no romance or passion between them, just a strange, deep intimacy between two people who understood each other without words. "Whatever happens, Lewis," she said quietly, her eyes still on the screen, "remember that everything I did for my own reasons, and I never meant to hurt you." Lewis didn't answer. He just covered her hand with his and continued watching the movie, feeling that their strange story was coming to an end, and not knowing whether he was happy about it or not. The next morning, Velma was gone. Lewis woke up alone in the motel room and found that her things were gone, along with a note on the table. "Thanks for everything. Take care. V." He wasn't surprised. She had left without warning before, but this time he had a strange feeling that he would never see her again. Lewis loaded a shipment of electronics into his truck and headed west to Des Moines. The road seemed unusually empty without Velma's silent presence. He put on an audiobook, a Raymond Chandler detective novel, but turned it off after half an hour. His thoughts kept returning to his strange traveling companion and her last words. When he stopped at a gas station in the suburbs of Moline, he went into a convenience store for a coffee and saw the local newspaper. The headline on the front page read, "Businessman's Body Found in Chicago Hotel." Lewis didn't know why he decided to buy the newspaper. Perhaps it was professional deformation. After many years at an insurance company, he had become accustomed to reading about accidents and crimes. Returning to the cab, he unfolded the newspaper and read the article. Gordon Pierce, a businessman from Nebraska, had been found dead in a room at the Lakeside Hotel in Chicago. The police suspected murder. Lewis frowned. He and Velma were staying at a motel near that hotel. Coincidence? Most likely. But for some reason he felt uneasy. Over the next 2 weeks, Lewis delivered cargo to Des Moines, Omaha, and Kansas City. Velma didn't show up. He tried to get her out of his mind, but he couldn't, especially after he found 2 more newspaper articles about similar murders in cities where he and Velma had stayed in recent months. Businessmen, one in Salt Lake City, the other in Boise, both found in hotel rooms, both strangled. The articles hinted at a possible connection between the murders. In Kansas City, he was sitting in a roadside cafe when a news story on TV caught his attention. A reporter was standing in front of a police station talking about a series of murders of businessmen in several states in the Midwest and West. The police suspected that all of them were the work of one person, possibly a woman, judging by some of the evidence. Lewis felt a chill run down his spine. He returned to his truck and opened his laptop. He began searching for information about the murders mentioned in the news. He found articles about 6 cases, all with similar characteristics. The victim was a middle-aged man, often a businessman or professional, found in a hotel room, usually strangled. There were no signs of forced entry. The police assumed that the killer was someone the victims had voluntarily let into their rooms. Now that he had all the information in front of him, Lewis couldn't ignore the coincidences. 5 of the 6 murders had taken place in cities where he and Velma had stayed. What's more, the dates coincided with periods when she had disappeared or said she needed to stay in town for a couple of days. "This is crazy," Lewis said aloud, slamming his laptop shut. Velma couldn't be a serial killer. Yes, she was strange, mysterious, with a dark sense of humor. But a killer? A person who cold-bloodedly strangled people in hotel rooms? It didn't make sense, and yet doubt lingered inside him. He remembered their conversation about whiskey at the motel, her strange question about whether he had ever wanted to kill someone. He remembered her disappearances, her unexplained appearances and disappearances, the wad of cash in her backpack, her words about being selective with her victims. The last straw was a call he received 3 days later while delivering a load to Springfield, Missouri. An unfamiliar number, a male voice. "Louis Brennan?" Lewis tensed. No one had called him by his last name since he left Rockford. "Who's this?" "Detective Alex Monroe, Kansas City Homicide. I need to talk to you." They met at a small cafe on the outskirts of Springfield. Detective Monroe was a tall African-American man in his 50s, with graying hair cut short and tired but alert eyes. He showed Lewis his badge and ordered coffee for both of them. "I understand you know a woman named Velma Reed," he began without preamble. Lewis nodded, feeling his throat go dry. "She used to travel with me sometimes. I'm a truck driver." "I know," Monroe said, opening the folder he had brought with him. Louis Brennan, 42 years old, former insurance manager in Rockford, Illinois, quit his job suddenly, withdrew money from his accounts and disappeared, leaving his wife behind. Now he works for Horizon Logistics, driving trucks all over the Midwest. "You ran a background check on me," Lewis said, not asking but stating. "It's my job," the detective shrugged, "especially when it involves a series of murders in 7 states. "I have nothing to do with this," Lewis said firmly. "I believe you," Monroe nodded. "But you were in contact with the prime suspect for several months. That makes you an important witness." Lewis sighed deeply. So his suspicions had been correct. Velma really was the killer. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," said the detective. "How you met, what you talked about, where you went, where you stayed. Any details about her behavior, habits, things she carried with her, anything that might help us find her." Lewis spent the next 2 hours talking about their chance meeting at a diner in South Dakota, about the strange friendship that developed between them, about the cities they passed through, the hotels where they stayed, about Velma's habit of changing her appearance, about her disappearances, about the wad of cash in her backpack, about that strange conversation about murder. Monroe took notes, asked a few clarifying questions, but mostly just listened. When Lewis finished, the detective stared at his notes for a long time, then looked up. "Mr. Brannigan, do you realize that you helped a serial killer travel across the country?" "I didn't know." Lewis shook his head. "I swear I didn't." "I believe you," Monroe said again. "But the fact remains. The woman you know as Velma Reed has killed at least 6 men, possibly more. Who is she really?" The detective took a photograph out of the folder and placed it on the table. It was Velma, but with long blonde hair and thick-rimmed glasses. She looked younger and, somehow, more ordinary. Her real name is Donna Mae Whitley. She grew up in Tuskegee, Alabama. At 20, she married Theodore Whitley, a local businessman who owned a chain of auto repair shops. 3 years into their marriage, Theodore Whitley was found dead in a motel outside of town, strangled. Donna received a large insurance payout and disappeared. Since then, she has been changing her name and appearance, moving from city to city, and leaving a trail of dead bodies behind her. "Why?" was all Lewis could ask. "Serial killers rarely have rational motives, Mr. Brennan," Monroe sighed. "But in this case, there is something interesting. All the victims are men of a certain type, 45 years old, successful careers, married, and they all have one thing in common which we only discovered recently." "What is it?" "They were all unfaithful to their wives." Lewis stared at the detective in shock. "You mean she kills men who cheat on their wives?" Monroe nodded. "It may have started with her own husband. Then it grew into an obsession, a mission. She somehow selects them, tracks them down, gets to know them, and kills them. A classic case of a serial killer with a motive for revenge." Lewis felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered Velma's words about her being selective in her victims. Now those words took on a sinister meaning. "There's something else," Monroe said, looking Lewis straight in the eye. "Yesterday we found another victim, the 7th, Elliot Forsyth, an art history professor from Rockford, Illinois." The name hit Lewis like a physical blow. Elliot Forsyth, his wife's lover, the man who had broken up his marriage, the man whose house Haley had entered while taking off her wedding ring. "That's impossible," he gasped. "Unfortunately, it's very possible," Monroe said, looking at him sympathetically. "Forsyth was found dead in his home 3 days ago, strangled, same modus operandi as the other murders. And we found Donna's, I'm sorry, Velma's, trail in the city. She was there, Mr. Brennan, and she killed the man your ex-wife was having an affair with." Lewis felt the room begin to spin before his eyes. It was too much. The coincidence seemed incredible, almost impossible. And yet, "She knew," he whispered. "Somehow she knew about him, about Haley, about everything." "We think she didn't choose you by accident," Monroe said. "She probably found out about your history and decided to help in her own way. It's part of her psychosis. She sees herself as some kind of avenger bringing justice to betrayed spouses." "My God!" Lewis covered his face with his hands. "Mr. Brennan," the detective leaned closer, "we need your help to find her. She's dangerous and she'll kill again." Lewis slowly lowered his hands and looked at Monroe. "What do you want me to do?" "She may contact you again. If that happens, you must notify us immediately. We'll give you a number you can call anytime." "What if she doesn't contact you?" "Then we'll continue searching for her using our usual methods. But to be honest, we don't have many leads. She's smart, cautious, and experienced at disappearing." The detective gave Lewis his business card with his phone number and asked him to stay in touch. They agreed that Lewis would report his whereabouts so that the police could respond quickly if Velma showed up. After Monroe left, Lewis remained seated in the cafe, trying to make sense of what had happened. The woman with whom he had spent the last few months, whom he trusted, with whom he shared the silence of the road and rare conversations in the evenings, turned out to be a serial killer. Worse, she had killed Elliot Forsyth. Clearly because of him, because of his story. He remembered all their conversations, all the oddities in Velma's behavior, all the coincidences that now formed a coherent, terrifying picture. How could he have been so blind? Or did part of him know, suspect, but not want to admit the truth? Lewis returned to his truck and continued on his route. He delivered the cargo to Springfield, then headed to St. Louis with a shipment of household appliances. All the while, his mind kept returning to his conversation with the detective, to the revelations about Velma, to Forsyth's murder. He should have felt disgust, horror, anger. But instead, there was a strange emptiness inside him. And somewhere deep down, in a place he didn't want to admit even to himself, there was a dark, grim satisfaction. The man who had destroyed his marriage was dead, and Velma had done it for him, or because of him. That thought frightened Lewis the most. Not that he was traveling with a murderer, not that he could become an accomplice, albeit an unwitting one, but that part of him was grateful to Velma for killing Forsyth. A week passed. Lewis continued to work, drive his routes, and report to Detective Monroe. Velma didn't show up. The police found no new leads. A week later, there was another murder. In Omaha, a businessman from Denver was found in his hotel room. Same modus operandi. Lewis began to notice that he was constantly looking for Velma at truck stops, roadside cafes, and gas stations. He didn't know what he wanted more, for her to show up or to disappear forever. In early November, he was driving a load from Kansas City to Chicago. He stopped for the night at a roadside motel in Peoria. He paid for the room, took a shower, and went to bed. Around midnight, he was awakened by a soft knock on the door. Lewis knew who it was before he opened it. Velma stood in the doorway, her short black hair pulled back, wearing a black jacket and jeans. She looked tired but calm. "Hi, Lewis," she said quietly. "Hi, Velma, or should I call you Donna?" She flinched slightly but quickly regained her composure. "So you already know." "The police came to my place, Detective Monroe." "Yes, I expected that," she nodded. "Can I come in? I promise I won't hurt you." Lewis stepped back, letting her into the room. Part of him screamed to call Monroe immediately. Another part wanted to hear what Velma had to say. She sat down on the edge of the bed, as she always did when they stayed in motels. She looked the same as always, a little tired from the road, a little distant. It was hard to believe that this woman had killed 8 people. "I think you want to ask me some questions," Velma said. "Why did you kill Elliot Forsyth?" Lewis asked, sitting down across from her on the only chair in the room. "Because he deserved it," she replied simply. "He ruined your life, Lewis. He knew what he was doing when he seduced your wife. There are too many men like that in the world. Men who take what they want without thinking about the consequences for others." "Like your husband?" "Yes," she nodded. "Ted was the first. I found out he was cheating on me. Not just once, but for years, with different women. When I found the proof, I felt liberated, like I finally had permission to do what I'd been thinking about for a long time, to strangle him, to take his last breath." She spoke of murder so calmly, so matter-of-factly that Lewis felt a chill run down his spine. What about the others, all those men? They were all just like Ted, like Elliot Forsyth, married men cheating on their wives. I'm just removing them from the world, making it a better place. "That's insane, Velma." "Maybe," she shrugged, "but you have no idea how much pain people like that cause, how many lives they ruin with their lust, their selfishness. You're living proof of that." Lewis shook his head. "I don't condone what Forsyth did, but murder, that's not the answer." "It is for me," Velma said firmly, "and I don't regret a single one of my victims. Why did you come to me? You must know the police are looking for you. They could have been watching me." They could have, Velma agreed. But I watched your motel for several hours. No sign of surveillance. I came to say goodbye, Lewis, and to tell you the truth. You deserve it. Where are you going now? Somewhere they won't find me, she repeated the phrase she had said before. I have a plan. New documents, a new identity. I'll start over. And you'll keep killing? Velma looked him straight in the eye. I do what I think is right. The world isn't black and white, Lewis. Sometimes you have to get your hands dirty to restore balance. They sat in silence for several minutes. Lewis knew he had to call Detective Monroe immediately. The phone was on the nightstand next to the bed. One call and the serial killer would be caught. It was his civic duty, his moral obligation. And yet, looking at the woman across from him, he didn't see a monster, a cold-blooded killer, but Velma, his companion on the long road, the only person in recent months with whom he felt any kind of connection, the person who, albeit in a twisted way, had restored justice for him. I have to turn you into the police, Lewis said. I know, Velma nodded. It's the right thing to do. But I'll give you a head start, he continued. 24 hours. Then I'll call Monroe and tell him about our meeting. She smiled, the same soft, slightly sad smile he knew so well. Thank you, Lewis. You're a good man, the best I've met in a long time. Velma stood up, walked over to him, and kissed him lightly on the forehead. Goodbye. I hope you find what you're looking for. She left the room as quietly as she had entered. Lewis didn't move for a long time after she left. Then he lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. In the morning, he called Detective Monroe and told him about Velma's visit. He described her new appearance and confirmed her involvement in the murders, including Forsyth's. But he didn't mention that he had given her a day's head start. The police began a search, but Lewis knew they wouldn't find her. Velma, or Donna, or whatever she called herself now, was too smart, too careful. She would disappear, change her name, and start a new life, and perhaps continue her twisted mission somewhere else. A week later, Lewis returned the truck to Horizon Logistics and quit his job. He couldn't be on the road anymore, couldn't stay in the same motels, go to the same cafes, all the places that now reminded him of Velma. He bought a used pickup truck and headed south to Florida. He got a job at a small construction company in Key West, as far away as possible from the cold roads of the Midwest, from the places where he had met Velma, from the history he was trying to leave behind. Sometimes, especially at night, Lewis thought about Velma, about where she was now and what she was doing, whether she was continuing her deadly mission or had found another way to deal with the demons of her past. He would never know the answer to that question, and perhaps that was for the best. His new life was simpler, quieter, completely cut off from his past. He was no longer Lewis Brennan from Rockford, an insurance company manager with a broken marriage. And he wasn't Lewis the truck driver, friend of a serial killer. Now he was just Lewis, a builder from Key West, a man with no history. And yet, sometimes, as he drove past a deserted stretch of highway or saw a lone female figure on the side of the road, he felt a strange excitement, almost hope. Perhaps their paths would cross again someday. Perhaps they would once again share the silence of a long journey, asking no questions about the past, saying nothing about the future, just two people running away from their own shadows. Meanwhile, Lewis continued to live day after day, building houses for other people and trying to find the peace that still eluded him, despite the thousands of miles he had left behind.